Chapter 18. Richard Isaac stood gazing out the window from the 32nd floor executive office, Atlanta, at his feet. The streets were empty below, but for a few pedestrians dashing for cover beneath umbrellas. Timing was everything in this business. You couldn't make a killing when people are dying, especially if you hadn't planned for their death. Business thrived on stability and growth.
I don't like violence, Tom. I'm a businessman. Blood is a big expense.
And for that stability, sometimes you had to play cutthroats. He heard the soft click as the door to the boardroom opened behind him. The man's broad shoulders and slim builds made his silhouette against the window belie how close he was to retirement. As if you would retire in the middle of the biggest hand of your life, not when you're playing cutthroats. He turned. The sunlight slanting in through the window shimmered from the obsidian tresses of Carrie Archer. She glided into the room, perfect as always. She may have been wearing widow's black, but the swell of her breast, the shift of her hip against silk, assured him she wouldn't be alone for long. Not if he had anything to do with it. Stability. All of them needed to be in Richard Isaac's pocket if he was going to keep this ship on course. Archer Industries must thrive. He'd invested too much in what he knew about this company. The way it operated, and the under-the-table tricks Henry Archer had used to build it. All good products did not make a company great. Most of it was knowing how to manipulate money and power and the markets to find the loopholes in the laws, trade just a little closer to the inside than many might feel comfortable doing. And when the players get nervous when they start worrying that their house of cards might fall, it was Richard who knew just where to leak the word to investigators to break up the game. And when the dust settled, Isaacs always walked away unscathed, with obscene amounts of cash in his pocket, and ever more power.
The only thing that counts in the end is power. Naked, merciless force!
It was Henry Archer who had taught Richard the game at which Richard excelled. Archer Industries had been poised to make the next great leap. Richard and Henry planned to bring in Isaac Stevens, a heavy if there ever was one in the corporate battleground. But he'd crossed Richard one too many times, the last one he'd forced his daughter Irene to end her relationship with Richard, right there, loudly on the grounds of the Polo Club before hundreds of Atlanta's most well-heeled citizens. Stevens would give Isaacs the distance he needed when they started taking over their rivals, company by company, and piecing them out, converting the stock options, doing the deals, raking in the dough. And if someone must fall, all along the plan had been to take Isaac down, while Archer Industries' subsidiaries concealed the deals. Richard and Henry were too good at this game to fail. They'd only miscalculate once in their 30-year partnership. They hadn't expected Archer to drive off a cliff. Archer! Callie gave Isaacs a bare nod, a hint of a smile as she turned her back to him and walked along the bookcases that lined one wall. She ran her fingers along the spines, letting them linger on the masters, books that had never been cracked. Of course, Henry Archer was too important to be troubled with reading fiction, poetry, plays.
And I feel sorry for you and your lack of soul.
But a wealthy man who had built his company from nothing needed a library, and he needed to surround himself with art and the accoutrements that demonstrated he was a thinking man. But Henry's passions were the machinery of business, economics, and industry. Those were the well-thumbed books closest to his desk, and his passions had been serious as well. Invention, transportation, and keeping his wife content. The last mattered most to Callie, of course. She would be well cared for. Her prenuptial agreement assured her of that. But prestige, that was something a little harder to come by in this city. And with a background like hers, prestige came from marrying well.
Get on with it.
At last she settled in the seat behind that massive, imposing desk from which Henry Archer ran his world.
I'm Henry the Eighth, I am. Henry the Eighth, I am.
You wanted to see me? Callie asked him pointedly, one brow arched up, almost lost in a lock of hair that had drifted lower on her brow, like the question mark punctuating her sentence.
I know this is a difficult time for you, Mrs. Archer, but you must understand the business of the company must move forward,
Richard said brusquely. He bent over the desk toward her, his ruddy cheeks so close to hers she could see his paws. She leaned back a little, then followed his gazes that had so briefly touched on her breast before it moved to linger at her throat. In her hair, and that was pulled deep into her eyes.
Henry and I spoke at length about the direction the company needs to take to be competitive,
Richard crooned as he gazed into her eyes.
This company was a passion of his, you know, and I was about to help him double, triple its value. You need someone in place to make those decisions now that Henry can't.
Why, Mr. Isaacs, I'm so pleased to hear your confidence in me,
she said demurely, though he could see a devil lurking behind those eyes of hers. It kindled the flames smouldering in her gaze.
Of course, I haven't had much experience running a company like Archer Industries, but sure Henry would be pleased that it's stayed in the family.
Richard leaned back. Was she playing him as he was trying to play her? What had fired up that spark in her eye? Was she planning to take over the company? Did she have the gall to do something like that? With effort he pulled his gaze from hers and strode to the window.
What's your game, Mrs. Archer?
He asked, staring over at Atlanta. His voice barely raised a little, with a unconcealed anger.
You know you don't have the experience to run a company like this. Henry and I worked side by side for 30 years.
He pounded one fist into his open other palm, in rhythm to his words.
We built this company together. I know what his plans were for growing the business,
he said angrily.
So you think you should be running it?
Callie asked with that disarmingly innocent gaze of hers, the one that seemed to flash like the lightning playing across the rooftops of Atlanta, moving swiftly from chimney to gable until it reached its target with a burst of heat and smoke. That was Callie Archer's gaze.
I wouldn't presume to, Mrs. Archer,
he enunciated somewhat crisply, turning from the window to lay a gentle hand on her shoulder.
You are entitled as owner of the company to sit at its head, but Henry had planned for some time to bring in Isaac Stevens to coordinate some buyouts and sell-offs, all of it tricky and confusing and more than a grieving wife should have to bear,
he said in a tone Callie thought might be paternal or condescending or even genuinely caring. Did Richard Isaacs even know how to grieve for Henry Archer? She wasn't sure even she could grieve a man who treated his wife like any of the other baubles he'd collected to build his image. Richard read the hesitation in her eyes and leaned in close over her shoulder.
Let me guide you, Mrs. Archer. First we bring on Stevens, as planned.
Are you happy now, Stevens?
Once he's installed, he'll begin buying up Archer Industries' competitors and dividing them up into existing divisions, then sell them off, bit by bit, exercising options and building this company into the large cap company it ought to be.
He turned her in the chair so that she faced him, the sunlight blinding on her dark waves of hair. The fire lit again in those eyes of hers as her breasts rose in breaths that seemed to quicken beneath his gaze.
Think of it, Mrs. Archer. Callie, think of it,
he exclaimed.
You can carry on your life as you always have, leaving the tedious business dealings to me. But the power will be yours. You will be Archer Industries. It'll be your books that line the walls, your charity events in the news, your parties the town will be talking about. Who knows, you may even find love again. I imagine a woman of your uncommon beauty and means would never need to be alone.
He swept toward her, his silhouette resolving into a well-built man only slightly older than Henry's 60 years, his face quickly fading from the silhouette of a dark demon to a ruddy-cheeked imp who looked like he'd be at home on a soccer field.
If that's your wish,
he offered deferentially.
It is,
she said, catching her breath. Something about him made her heart pound, as if she had agreed to work in a league with the devil himself. It's time for it to be about me, isn't it? She thought to herself.
Then you will meet him,
he said forcefully.
We have an agreement, then. You'll accept my counsel?
He thrust out his hand. She took it in both of hers and leaned toward him, tilting her head to look him in the eye, her breasts jostling with the black satin dress she wore.
I look forward to working with you.
Again she gave him that glinting glance, an almost wicked smile playing across her lips. What was her game?
Georgia on my mind.
This chapter almost felt like it came from a real book, didn't it? A boring book, but it would be nice if any of these plot points would come back. Anyway, thanks to all of my Patreon supporters, particularly Break System BSE and Michael Maris. If you want to see your name up here, just head over to the Patreon. Throw me a couple of bucks a month.